Got this. All right. Well, hello, everyone. It's good to see all of you on this auspicious day. It's amazing to see so many familiar faces who have grown to care for so much over my years here. So it's wonderful to see you, and I'm happy to give this one last workshop here, though it will not be, how should I say this? This is the closing of a chapter, but not goodbye. So I look forward to seeing you all at Da Vinci and throughout Philadelphia for many years to come. And you better believe I'll be checking up on these rascals and making sure the exhibitions are up to snuff. So the topic we have today for our creative conversations is a bit of a tutorial for Photoshop. And I know Photoshop is an incredibly intimidating program that has a notoriously steep learning curve. However, us as artists have maybe more narrow needs in terms of creating images of our artwork to submit to shows, jury calls, or documenting for our own websites, publications, etc. It really comes down to documenting the work that we do physically. And so I wanted to kind of narrow the scope of what we do here in Photoshop to something a little bit more digestible, especially for folks who are maybe less familiar with Photoshop, and so that we can all have wonderful images of our artwork. And so I'm just going to kind of dive into one particular process that I use every time that I have a new piece of artwork that I'm finished completing in my studio. And then I need to turn that into a wonderful photo and send that off into the ether of the internet for whatever reason. However, my studio is in the basement of a row home, which is not particularly great for documenting artwork. And frankly, it's not that great to make artwork in either, but we make do with what we have. And so I am going to use this wonderful example from this exhibition. You can actually see it right up there. This painting is from Nasir here. This wonderful little painting is called Michael's here, which is the name of that corner store that you can see there. So what I've done is I took this very simple photograph just with a very outdated iPhone, which is going to be perfectly fine for our uses here. iPhones and most phones that we all have these days have increasingly amazing cameras, and you can do more and more with them every single day, even if they are somewhat outdated. But there are some kind of key factors that can be done in Photoshop to make your artwork look amazing. And there are also some things in Photoshop that they're just truly better to change while you're taking the photo. Some of those key factors are actually involve reflections. Reflections are something that are really challenging if you have glossy surfaces in some of your images, and truthfully are easier to solve in photographing your art than in photoshopping it. And so if you can ever solve that issue ahead of time, it's easier to do so. However, you would be very surprised what you can fix in Photoshop. And so we're going to deal with the majority of those issues today while circumnavigating hotspots. So I took two photographs of this image here. This was one of them, which I just laid on the floor here. And you'll notice here that this painting has a bit of gloss on it. And so right up here, especially around the sky, there was a glaze on this painting where I was getting some hot spots. And that was because it was laid on the ground, which is perpendicular to all these lights. And so if I imagined a diagram of where my light was coming from, my light would be at the exact same location that this artwork is completely perpendicular to the surface of that artwork. That's really troubling when you have your light source hitting that artwork and then bouncing back right towards your eye or the camera. That's when glare is going to happen. And so this very kind of simple diagram shows you the ideal way to set up your 2D artwork in terms of lighting and photographing. Ideally, you want your light sources to gently rake across the surface so that that glare is actually not hitting where the perspective of your camera or eye is going to be. This is something that you would ideally want to have. This is often something that is very difficult to manage if you say have your studio in the basement of a row home and you don't have much space to work with. Some folks have found that photographing artwork outside on a cloudy day is maybe a good trick. Otherwise, any way that you can have a lot of ambient light with a consistent light source is going to be a fair bet. Ultimately, you're really looking for consistency and diffused lighting in almost every situation. Even if that lighting is overtly cool or overtly warm, as long as it's consistent, you can solve all those other factors in Photoshop. So that taking your painting out to the backyard to photograph it is going to have a really blue image, but that's okay as long as it's consistently blue and consistently in the not a shadow in some part in the sun. Obviously, it's a little bit easier to manage smaller works like we have today, but that's what we're working with. And so you'll see why this photo is actually better than this photo. So in this photo, I have it propped up right over here. And so you can look at some of those same spots that were causing us problems, like right around here in the sky. And I'm actually not getting any of that glare or those hot spots. So this is, in terms of just the painting itself, very consistently lit. There's a lot of ambient light just kind of getting bounced around here, even though I don't have it on the wall perfectly as is. Everything looks pretty even. There's no spots that are overly warm or overly cool, no spots that are clearly in shadow or getting inconsistent light raking onto it. And so this is good enough to work with right now. And so what we're going to do is we are going to transform this photograph into this. So this is our end goal here. These are the same photographs, just with several additions here that you can see in my layer section over here, things that I have done to this photograph. And this is going to be ultimately our outcome here. And so if we zoom in, you can see there's this kind of like fake shadowy area down here, which isn't totally invented. There's a drop shadow back here, even the white wall itself, all completely fake. And so we're going to be able to do this. This image is going to be really good for you if you want to put this image on your website, if you're sending it to a juror. The only part of this that I would maybe give pause to is if you are making a book and you are doing print publication. That scenario is often requires the most amount of resolution, the largest DPI. These are all just fancy words for saying really big image, lots of data. There's lots of pixels incorporating into what your image is looking at. When people say 300 DPI, what that means is there's 300 pixels per inch. If you map this out, if you imagined a huge grid over this whole image, that's what DPI means. Dots per inch, pixels per inch, they're interchangeable terms. And so you can still do this process and eventually end up in print. As long as your artwork image that you're using here is big enough, you'll be totally fine. What we're focused here on is everything outside of these bounds to make it look like you're on a nice clean white wall when you don't have a nice clean white wall. So any questions before we jump in to transform this photograph here? Yeah, what's up?
What camera did you take these photos with?
This 5-year-old iPhone. Yes.
What's the size of the image that
Good question. We can look it up in Photoshop. So I'm going to go up here to image and canvas size. So right now it's quite large. Let's actually change our units to pixels. And I have about 3,000 by 4,000 pixels. Yeah, it's big. most cameras that are in phones, what they lack in a large lens make up for in huge pieces of data. They just have a lot of pixels, and that just translates to a lot of data. So you can actually see where it says new size right here, 34.9 megs. That is a very large image in terms of data and in terms of pixels, actual sizes.
So
Yeah.
you wouldn't actually use, isn't that too much to put like on your website that it would take too long?
It probably will be. And so when we actually go to save this, we will compress it down a little bit to something a little bit more manageable, like 2 or 3 megs. Yes.
Sorry, I missed the earlier part. I'm just wondering that elements, Photoshop, elements, phone version.
Mm-hmm.
You do everything in elements. I assume this is a regular Photoshop.
This is regular standard retail Photoshop. I believe everything that we're going to do today, you can do in Elements. There is a lot of things up here that we are just never going to use. Probably in my lifetime, there's like a 3D thing. There's animation capacity in Photoshop. You're never going to want to use it. Like there's plugins. There's just truly so much stuff that is amazing if you need it, but really confusing if you don't. So we're going to avoid all of it. And instead, just going to edit some photos. We're going to get back to the basics. So if you have Elements, I'm 99% sure we're going to use every single tool that we're going to use. All the tools that we use will be in Photoshop Elements. Any other questions before we jump in? All right, great. So what we're going to do is we're going to come over to our Layers tab. So layers are a really, really important factor to understand here in Photoshop. And so if you think of layers as kind of the layers of a sandwich, you've got, bread, maybe you've got a meat, maybe you've got a cheese, lettuce, tomatoes, and another piece of bread. Photoshop works in that same way. So if you saw a cross section of a sandwich, you would be working in kind of the same scenario. So if I have this layer 1 on top of my photo down here, anything on top is going to be visible first. So if I say, grabbed a rectangle and I did that, it sits on top of my image because this is above it. I can also move my layers. So if I wanted that below it, it's actually now not visible because this whole image takes up my picture plane here. And again, move back up, there it is. So I'm actually going to keep this rectangle here because it's going to be useful for me to map out what the correct ratio of this otherwise rectangular painting needs to be. Because as you might notice here, this painting is not perfectly lined up to a nice consistent rectangle that's perpendicular to my camera. I'm a little bit off, and that's okay because we can fix it. And I will use my little rectangle to fix it. So I'm going to grab this rectangle here, and I'm going to come to the properties section up here. Properties tells me about what element I'm currently selected and some of the features about it. So for instance, this fill and stroke area would be what I use if I needed to change the color of this. Fill is on the inside of a shape, stroke is on the outside. And you can change all of those elements to make them look different. So I have a fill of red and a stroke of blue. And so you can see that reflected here. I'm going to go back to no stroke. And I guess I can keep red, actually. There's no real reason why I need to change it because I'm more concerned with the size of this rectangle here. So I know that that painting is 16 inches tall and 12 inches wide. That's important for me to know because when I look at this image here, I want this to be squared up to what seems to be my camera. That is consistently 16 inches tall, 12 inches wide. So I'm going to make myself a little guide. And what I want to do is I want to change this to, let's say, I said 12 inches and 16 inches. X is horizontal, Y is vertical. And, oh, whoops, just kidding. That's not where I need to do it. There we are. So you're looking at width and height right here, 12 inches, 16 inches. Sorry, X and Y is actually your coordinates on the picture plane itself. So I can move it and these numbers will change over here because I'm changing the point of origin of that shape. But we're consistently over here with 12 and 16 inches. This is important because this is the correct ratio of what our painting is actually going to look like in real life when you're not slightly off angle with your camera here. So I'm going to go ahead and just scale this up because I'm more important in the ratio of this image rather than the actual size of it as it appears on my screen. As long as the height is relative to the width, it's going to look correct. So I am going to size it up to, let's say here, and I've got it kind of in the center of this image here. You can see my pink guide is showing me that it's right in the center, and I can move it around and those guides disappear a little bit, and then I can snap to the center of my picture plane right here. So that's where I want my painting to be. So I'm going to go ahead and come back to my layers here, and I'm going to change the opacity of this rectangle so I can see through it, so that I can warp my actual photograph underneath it to fill my red rectangle with the painting underneath. So what that will look like is this little slider up here that says opacity. Opacity means transparency. And if I take this down to varying degrees, you can see through it more easily. So I'm going to take this down so I can see the painting behind it. Again, because of layers, that rectangle is sitting on top of it, but the opacity lets me see what's underneath. Again, I can move layers to more readily visible to see what I'm looking at here. And I'm actually going to go ahead and just lock this layer so that I won't be able to interact with it because I need to work on the thing right behind it instead. So now that I have this locked, I'm going to select this layer down here. You can see it's selected because it's that little bit lighter color. And so now I can interact with it. You can only interact with one layer at a time or whatever layers that you have selected. So if I held shift and clicked both of these things at the same time, you can see they're both selected so I can move them at the same time. But right now I want to leave that rectangle alone. So I'll lock it with that little lock icon and then come back down here to my photograph. And what I'm going to do is I want to stretch and transform this photograph so that the painting underneath it lines up with that red rectangle. So I am going to hold Control, which is the hotkey, to grab one of the corners of this photograph and stretch it. I can consequently do the same move if I come into Edit and Transform and Skew or Distort. Honestly, they're all kind of do about the same thing in terms of ours. There is, but it's not meaningful for whatever we're working on. I want to be careful to introduce too much kind of new vocabulary that you're never going to use. But we can do distort here. It's going to do truly no difference because I just want to stretch and pull those corners. So I'm going to go ahead and stretch that. So you can see the red rectangle isn't moving, but my photograph underneath it is. So I want to just line up these corners.
Why do you crop it to be the size of the picture?
Because I want to do it later. Because sometimes you want a little nice white background underneath your 2D image. Sometimes you don't want it. It's easier to make that decision at the very end and then maybe have multiple versions of the same photograph.
Are you using your cursor to stretch it?
Yep. Yeah, so this is my cursor over here. And I'm just grabbing each of these corners and futzing with it until I get the whole image ultimately encompassing that red rectangle. And if I get pretty close, I can actually zoom in here. There. Up.
Each corner works independently.
Yes. And you're gonna have to like work your way through each one of them because each one is independent. And so once moving one slightly skews all the others. So you just kind of zero in, you kind of nudge it into the right place. And now it looks like we're good. It looks like this whole painting has just like a red filter on it. That's perfect. And so I'm gonna go ahead and hit enter. And there we are. So this painting is now perfectly the correct ratio sitting on my picture plane here. And so I can go back and hide that. And there we are. That looks very similar to this image where it is perfectly perpendicular to the camera. Back here. All right, so I no longer need to use this rectangle very much anymore. And you can see these little eyeball icons over here. That just is an indicator of this layer being visible. So if it's clicked off, you can't see it. Clicked on, you can. So because I'm going to be doing some editing now to this picture plane, you know what? I'm going to actually just change this rectangle to white so I can have a nice clean background to look at. And I'm going to scale this up so it takes over the whole picture plane. And then I'm going to come back to properties. Oh, no. Layers will work just fine. Turn up that opacity. So just have a nice white background. I'm just going to go ahead and lock that so I don't have to think about it. Because now what we want to do is we want to delete all the information outside of our painting. So there's a couple different ways to do this. And there's increasingly more features built around locating a image, or rather an object from the background. You might have noticed there's a lot of new AI plugins for Photoshop these days that kind of end up on social media. Some of them are useful, some of them are not. There are a number of ways to select things. We basically want to select just the painting and nothing outside of it. And so you can do some smart selecting where you make Photoshop recognize areas that are in the painting and not in the painting. And you can see it's thinking very slowly about things that are inside that dotted line and things that are not. And so you're relying on visual information that Photoshop has to try to think through what's happening. So on the left side up here, there is your selection tools. And if you click and hold, you can see there's a few different types of selection tools. I picked quick selection tool right here, but this is something that I want to actually avoid because ultimately, as smart as AI and Photoshop is, it's usually not smarter than your eyes. At least not yet. One day maybe, but you can see there's some errors here. For instance, it has a hard time distinguishing between the shadow that's under here and the dark parts of this painting. Sometimes you'll also notice there's some kind of wobbly edges here. You can actually really zoom in and see there's like kind of a mark at the bottom of this painting that it tries to avoid including in our selection. I want to include this perfect rectangle. We went to such efforts to make a nice clean rectangle for this painting. I just want the rectangle and I don't trust Photoshop to smart select everything I need. You can actually see over here too, there's like a white edge to this painting here and it's trying to cut out information, but that's good information. I need to have it. Oh, holding control and plus or control and minus on the keyboard.
Is that true of Mac as well?
I think it's function plus, function minus. They're usually going to be all the same hotkeys, just with function involved in the operation as a substitute. So I'm going to zoom back out here, and I want to use a different tool. I want to use this polygon lasso. So what that means is that unlike the regular lasso tool here, where I can click and hold a shape, and then it gives me that shape that I can select. And if I wanted to move it, I can from there. Instead, I want a rectangle, and it's easier to do that if I can just click points and make a rigid shape right here, and then move that shape. So I'll clear that out, and I'm going to zoom in again. Nice and close, because I want to have a nice clean image. And this is the most arduous part of this entire process. So bear with me as I very carefully visually decide what is the bounding box that I want to work in. It's pretty easy for rectangles. Gets more complicated if you have some interesting and dynamic sculpture here. I can actually see that Nasir's painting has a bit of a lumpier edge over here, which I'm going to try to mimic, because that's all important characteristics of the painting. All right, there it is. That's the annoying part done. So now you can see that dotted line gives me just my perfect painting here. And so what I want to do now is back here, is I want to delete everything else but the painting. The selection tool gives me the inside of that shape, as I'm currently selected on right now. I want the opposite, actually. So what I'm going to do is come up to select at the top, because we're in the selection tool process here. I'm going to open it up, and I am going to inverse my selection. And so watch what the dotted line does on my image. So it stayed the same here, but then it gave me a one around the whole photograph here. So now I'm not selecting what's on the inside of that original rectangle. I'm looking at everything else on the image. And I would normally just hit delete here, but before I do, I actually need to change the characteristics of this layer to rasterize. This will be recorded. You can refer back to it. You don't need to know what rasterize means. All you need to know is that you need to be in it. Rasterize is one of two characteristics of a layer. There's smart layers and then rasterized layers. Rasterized layers means that you can directly edit each of the pixels independently. Smart layers allow you to do a lot of really high level Photoshop maneuvers that you don't need to ever think about ever. So rasterized it is. And now that it is rasterized, you can delete. And that's just, I literally hit the delete key. And so we're in pretty good shape. we've got a white background, which you can see is this rectangle right here. Otherwise, if you're not looking at it, it gives you this kind of gray and white checker that implies that there's nothing there. It seems a little distracting to me, so I'm going to look at this. Also, if, for instance, you have an image that is bigger than your bounding box of Photoshop here, that information is actually still there. It's just beyond the bounds of what you can see, because if I do this and shrink the image, you can still see that. Yes, exactly. So I don't want to get distracted. I want to make sure my file's nice and clean. So I'm just going to go ahead and just with my rectangle tool, select this and just also delete this stuff too. We don't need to think about any of it. We're just going to delete it. All right. Now that all that stuff is away, we just have our perfect isolated image here. And I can then reactivate my white rectangle background here. And now we can think about how to make this look a little bit more realistic. You need maybe a little bit of some shadows going on in the background. Maybe you need a little bit of a texture that mimics a real wall if you want to get really next level with it. But we want to make sure that this looks believable. But as it is right now, you have a very clean rectangle on a very clean white background. And if you want to leave it here, you could, but we're going to go in the next few steps. So what I want to do here is I want to maybe do some editing on this photograph. And I can change some of these things. I'm not going to get too into any of these visual adjustments today, but if we have time towards the end and we want to come back to it a bit more, we could. If I decided that, the lighting in this image is a little too maybe orange or yellow, I could go in here and change the color balance to make it maybe something a little bit more to what I think it is when using my eyes. My eyes are always smarter than anything that the computer gives us. So I could, for instance, change the color balance of this image to be maybe more yellow or less yellow, or more pink or more green, more red, or more teal. But if I'm otherwise satisfied with it, I can leave it as is. Or if I say, I think this image is a little too dark, I could maybe change the curves of this image, and I could bring my white levels up or my black levels up too. So now we have a lot of contrast going here. Whatever you need to do, you can do it. And you can do it because you can notice that this image is changing the photograph, but not the background, because the background is a separate layer than the photograph. And so this will allow you to work independently from what's behind the image. And that's going to be useful because we're going to add some shadows. So I am going to add a new layer while simultaneously moving my zoom interface because it's always in the way. Get out of here. So I need a new layer that is going to house my shadow. So I'm going to have this little plus sign down here, and that gave me a new layer 1. I'm going to name that shadow 1. And I like to do 3 shadows on any single image of a rectangular artwork sitting on a wall. Real life, there's lots of different shadows always interacting with different opacities and different characteristics. I really like to do 3 because I think it's the most realistic. So I'll show you the things that I do for each one of those 3 because they're always different. So my first shadow is always a wide shadow. It's something that would be reflected if you had a light hitting this image straight on. And because I know that this painting has actually got about an inch thickness to it, that's going to create a shadow mostly on the bottom of that rectangle and a little bit on the sides. Question, Pamela?
I just realized the piece was here.
It is. Yeah, there it is. Yeah, sorry. I said that in the beginning. It's okay. Yeah, there it is. That's why I just keep gesturing up there. So I want to make a nice soft shadow that captures that characteristic. So I'm going to start up here in the left corner here, and I'm going to again use my polygon selection tool to select the area that I think my shadow is going to be here. And so because I'm in my mind, the light is above this painting on the wall, I'm going to taper downwards from that top corner and then go all the way down outside of the bounding box of this picture plane so that my shadow can taper off into the ether. It's a gradient. And I'm going to make a rectangle and complete it here. You notice that I got really close to this edge here, but I'm kind of off here. That's okay because you can fix it after we make the thing. But generally you want it to look pretty close to a rectangle that is roughly just larger than the picture itself, and then all the way to the bottom of whatever you're cropping the photo to. So I could even use the rectangle selection tool if I really wanted to. Maybe that looks about right. So I'll use that. So I am on my shadow layer here so that I am putting whatever marking that I'm going to do just on this layer and not any of the other layers. And I am going to come over to my gradient tool. So shadows are tricky because they're always gradients. And so I'm going to select this gradient tool here. And you'll notice that it changed some things over here. And there's all different types of gradients here. And you can see some fabricated options here. So I could maybe just to show you how this works, show you what the gradient tool does normally. So this is a gradient that gives me a nice border between blue, a little bit of white in the middle, and then this kind of lovely tan here. And you can see that I can change the parameters of this tool to make it look different. So I don't think many shadows are blue and tan. So instead, I am going to not do a blue, but rather a black to a complete fade. So you'll notice here that this tool has black up in the corner and then this checkered pattern down here. The checkered pattern always means nothing in Photoshop. It is the absence of anything, is this particular very characteristic white and light gray checker. It means nothing. So I'm going to use this black on one side that fades into nothingness to replicate what a shadow might do. So I am going to put my nothingness down at the very bottom of this because I want my shadow to fade into the oblivion here. And then I can bring this painting back here and move my layers down. And so I can see if I hide this, we can see what I'm doing behind the image is I have a dark value that fades into nothing. And I can change again the parameters to change what that looks like. So right now, I'm really focusing on what's at the bottom of this painting here is this nice kind of gray rectangle that fades into white. Oh, really? Has a warm value? I think that's actually the screen. It looks very good on my computer, I promise. But you'll notice here is it has a really harsh edge. Normally, shadows have a nice soft edge to it. So this looks very fake. I want to make it look a little bit more real. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually delete this. And I'm going to try it again with a slight variation. I am going to, again, use my selection tool to select what I want to make my shadow. But I'm going to do one thing different. Wow, oh, gosh, Zoom, the bane of my existence. All right. Zoom got in the way. Got to do it again. Always got to be organized. Change the name of it to Shadow 1. And I will do this. Now that selection tool gives me a really harsh line that I didn't like before. So instead, I want to change what that looks like. So I want to come back up to my select interface up here, and I want to modify my selection so that it has a feathered border. So I'm going to change my 18 works for me, my feathered radius. And so it takes the bounding box of this rectangle that I've selected and it eases it out by 18 pixels. And so that'll look a lot more believable when I then come back to my gradient tool and do this. You'll notice that's got a nice soft edge on it now. And so then when I put this behind my image, this bottom line starts to look pretty good, but it needs more work. Normally shadows are going to be consistent behind that whole object and then immediately fade out quickly as you drop it. So right now it's too harsh up at the top and too light down here. So instead I'm going to add another third point to this gradient here. And then I'm going to click inside of it to assign black to it. So I have black and black and black, and then it quickly fades to nothing down here. And you can actually see it a little bit better down here. And then change this to a nice lighter gray because I want my black to be a little bit consistent. And I can just futz with these until I feel like I've got a pretty good looking shadow going. And you can move them and change them, whatever feels right in the moment. Because when you eventually need to add them back, this is looking mostly pretty believable. And I can then change the bounding box to this here. So if I was a little bit off here, I can make a nice tighter rectangle. And again, change it here. And I'm feeling pretty happy with how this is looking right now. You can see this transition is nice and soft on the edges here. And as we noticed with that rectangle tool before, I can change the opacity of this entire layer down right here. So if I want a nice soft shadow, I can do it here. And I can continuously edit it.
What is the advantage of that shadow? To make it look 3D?
Yeah.
So if it's a work on paper, you don't need that because you don't have depth.
If it's right up against the wall, you would have just the most minimal shadow in the world, probably towards the bottom. Or if that paper was floated off the wall a little bit, you'd have a larger shadow. But yeah, I'm just kind of like, because I know what this painting looks like in real life, I know that it's about 1 inch thick, and then my shadow should kind of reflect that.
So this could help you show it like in an environment.
Yes.
But if you're submitting it to a show, you normally just crop it to the
Edge.
You could, unless you want the curator or juror to visualize what that painting or 2D image would look like on their white wall. And so this is where I think it's useful. Sometimes when I get an image that's cropped right to the edge of the artwork, I sometimes might not have the full information of what the objectness of that image would be. You know, how physical is this object? Is it very flat? Is it extruded from the wall? Is it on some big, thick wooden cradle, or is it a very, very thin piece of paper? Yeah.
I'm sorry to keep going down this tangent, but if it's a work on paper, I've always struggled with like the text should I like fake a frame? Because really that's how it would be presented. You know what I mean? But I'm not gonna actually photograph it in the frame.
If it were me, I would fake it.
You fake the frame.
I would fake the frame, yeah. I would always want to tell the juror what to expect if they wanted to select this artwork. And so if you knew you were always going to frame it no matter what, I would probably give them the image including that frame. And maybe we can come back towards the end and I can maybe find like a frame on Google Image, and then we kind of just drop it in here, and then we just kind of make it seem like it would be in glass, but it's yeah.
I've seen like very fake looking versions of that, you know.
Yeah.
But like that's in the like,
Mhm.
things I don't love, but I feel like hey,
Yeah, you could make it look real too. Yeah, absolutely. The key is to not use a fake image of a frame, but use a real photograph of a frame, and then you just make it look like your artwork is in there.
got it.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
So I'm really comfortable with this first shadow layer. And so I think I'm ready to move on to my second shadow layer. So I'm going to add a new layer, shadow number 2 here. And I'm going to drag it below my photograph here. So my photograph is always on the topmost layer because it's going to hit my eye first. That's what in the fiction that I'm creating now, that's what's supposed to happen. And so this second shadow layer is actually going to be a bit of a more dramatic shadow, and you'll see why. And so I'm going to actually focus here just on the bottom of this. So normally when you look at that painting over there, there's a really harsh shadow towards the bottom of it. And that's what we're going to replicate here, is that drop shadow, because you can always assume that the lighting is mostly going to come from above the painting. So below it is going to have a heavier shadow. So that's what we're going to do here. And because I know this shadow is an inch thick, I'll kind of wrap my brain around what that could look like. And so oftentimes, if I'm imagining 2 lights on either side of the painting coming together and hitting the painting that's on the center of those 2, your shadow isn't going to be a box like this. It's actually going to be more of a trapezoid. So it's going to look closer to this. Yes.
What button did you just hold down to make that like power equal on both sides?
Shift. So whenever you're doing any tool and you want it to be straight or hit a normal angle, so normal being 90 degrees or sometimes even 45 degrees, you can just hold shift and do all the same commands. It'll just help you lock in to straight angles.
So is the trapezoid on the 45 button?
It is, yeah. And so what I'm going to do is I am going to create a bounding box, again, using my polygon tool. And I'm going to give it a little bit of a leeway up here towards the top. And you'll see why that is. And again, it's locking to those angles because I'm holding down shift right now. And so you know what? We're going to go off book here and we're going to do not 45-degree angles because I really like, and I think this is going to have a bit of a more acute angle. In my mind, that's what makes sense. But I am going to hold shift to make this a nice flat bounding box down here. And I'm just going to eyeball this. I think that's roughly a pretty good angle. And again, you can fix all of these angles later on after you've made the thing. So you don't need to be super precise. But that looks pretty good. Let's complete the shape here. And that's the bounding box that I want to work with right now. So similar to last time, I'm going to come back up to select, modify, and feather. And because this shadow in my mind is a little bit more dramatic, it's going to feather out to a smaller degree. So instead of 18 pixels from the center of the radius to the outside of it, let's say 10. So it's going to be a tighter radius. So I've got this selected and I can show you, I could do another nice soft gradient, but instead I'm going to show you a different way of doing kind of the same thing that honestly is a little bit simpler. Is I'm just going to use the brush tool. And I don't know why, but I apparently was doing something that was a small rectangle like this. That's not very useful. I'm just going to make it a nice big circle. There we are. So this is just my brush tool. What it does is allows me to change the settings here so you can see what I'm doing. I'm just coloring and I'll Control Z so I'll come back on it. But that's what it does. It just gives you whatever color you want in that space. That's it. And you can change the opacity of that brush here. So this is black. And because I can always change the opacity of a layer later on, I'm going to do this whole shadow. I'm just going to cover the whole thing in black because we can change it later. Color, 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 color. It's all black. There we go. And you can see it has a nice soft edge here because that's very useful. And I can change the opacity here just to that whole layer. And so now this is starting to look a little bit more real. But normally, because this is only an inch thick in terms of its cradle, it probably wouldn't have the whole shadow drop this far. I think that's a little bit fake. So I am going to just erase the bottom of it. So the eraser tool is down here or Command E, and it gives me this nice rectangle tool. And I can, again, just paint over it. And I can change the parameters of the hardness. So if I have hardness at 100, it gives me a nice crisp line like that, or undo that very quickly and give a very soft hardness of 0, nice feathery edge. And I like that for what our shadow is. So I'm going to scale this up so I can have a nice smooth edge. Yeah. And I'm clicking and holding. Maybe I'll do another pass here. This is starting to look maybe a little bit believable here. So this is a little bit more manual than doing that gradient tool selection. And again, I can select this and kind of change its placement on the wall here, change its shape a little bit, move it. But it feels pretty good. I can check out my layers here and maybe I'll zoom out to really get a scope of what that looks like. It's a little on the harsh side for me. And so I might take the opacity up a little bit and maybe I'll move it upwards just a hair. It's looking pretty good.
Even though you have the blue.
Oh, this?
The top of the rectangle, but it doesn't interfere with me underneath.
Yeah, it's underneath.
Even though
Yeah, so if I wanted
the
to,
line is above.
if I hid that whole thing, this is what our artboard looks like if the painting were not there. But I'm working with it right now as
What do you need
visible.
shadow 1 for? Because you have extra shadow 1. Get rid of it.
Shadow 1 is the.
So you can still see shadow number 1.
But you wouldn't see both. Right?
Yeah.
No, you would see both. It oftentimes in real life, there's multiple shadows in a room. And so this is replicating some of that. So you can still see right here,
Oh, yeah.
there's a little bit of a shadow 1. Shadow 2 is a little bit more dramatic, a little bit more visible. And you know what? I'm still not entirely happy. I think why I'm not happy with is I think the gradient is not big enough. I think it needs to transition to white slower. So I'm going to come back to my eraser. I'm going to scale up this to maybe 1,000 pixels. So I have a nice big, and you can see it's making that shadow just a little bit more delicate on the bottom side here as I'm smoothing it out. I think I like that a little bit more, and I'll zoom out. Yeah, that's starting to look a little bit more real. All right, I'm feeling pretty happy with that. It's a very kind of inexact science, so you can really kind of play with this until you like it. And the last and simplest shadow, and also the harshest, comes next. Shadow number 3. And what I have noticed visually is that to add an appropriate kind of weight to an image like this, I really want there to be a nice crisp black or dark line covering the bottom here. And so I'm basically just adding a nice underline to the whole painting, just to make it look a little bit more real. And so I have a nice long rectangle here. Again, I'm going to come back up to select, modify, and feather because it's still a shadow, but I'm going to make it only 5 this time. And then I'll come back to my, I guess, far too large paintbrush here. And I'm going to paint that whole thing black.
Times that we decided to accept the painting we're not based on the shadows that are.
Never.
But
But
that's exactly not enough bang for the buck of how hard it is to do.
maybe, or I'm not cognizant of when a photo looks really, really, really good versus good. Also, I'm a perfectionist. And so if you want to stop, at this level, ignoring all those shadows, you could, you really, really could. Or if you want to be a little bit crazy like me and you want to do all of those things, you could. And so I actually am gonna, we're at 100 now. I'm gonna take it down just to like right there. I think that is looking pretty good. I think it's a little bit too wide though. Yeah, that looks real. Yeah, see this edge right here where you get a little bit of black but not hitting all the sides because these imaginary lights are on both sides of the painting, so it would crop in slightly as it comes down. That's what I'm looking at. All right, so this is looking pretty darn good.
Uneven painting on the wall, with little bumps.
Oh, that's what I'm going to talk about next. You thought I was done being a perfectionist. I am not. So what I did is I Googled, let's see, white paint wall texture. And I found this image and then I downloaded it. Yes. And then here it is. That's the image.
You don't go to the gallery you're gonna submit it to and take a picture of that?
I have done that before, so at me. It's okay. So I'm just gonna select this image. I just dropped it into Photoshop because it's easy to see. I'm just gonna hit Command Copy, which is Control C or Function C if you're on a Mac, and come back to my layer over here. Move, start a new. Get out of here, zoom, start a new layer, and then hit paste. So this is that image. This is my wall texture. And I am going to scale it up.
Did that change the texture?
So you can see those little like bumps, those tiny little bumps. And obviously this is like a really awkwardly painted wall or whatever this is. We're going to fix that. Walls don't really look like this. And so instead, I am going to make this less dramatic and textured looking by first, I don't want any color. I want this to be a nice white wall. And whatever I'm pulling from Photoshop or Google might not be wholly white. And so I'm going to change the saturation of this image. And this is the saturation level. What this changes is if you have a blue, it would change it to a very, very royal, very intense blue, as opposed to a gray. So if I took it all the way to this side, it would be very, very vibrant. If I took it all the way to this side, it would be gray. This isn't changing much because it looks like my original image was perfectly unsaturated, which is good for me. So I'm just going to make sure that it's all the way down to 0. And lightness I could change, and I want this to be more white. I want it to be just south of perfect white. I just want the echo of the kiss of a texture, just nothing more. So I'm going to take this to very, very light. There we go. That's looking good. And because I want this to be behind all of the other things that we've created here, I'm going to take this layer, which I should honestly named wall. And I think we never did anything with that. So this is my wall texture. I'm going to take this all the way to the bottom here. And I guess we don't need this rectangle anymore. This was just the white rectangle. I don't want to look at it anymore. So I'm just going to delete it. Oh, but first I have to unlock it before I delete it. So this wall texture, you can still see it. As I zoom in here, you can see, that little bit of texture here. And I think it's still a little bit too dramatic for my liking. And so I'm gonna further change the curves on it so that it is lighter. I feel happy with this. So there's a lot of different ways to change images. I like to use this curve selection. What that does is actually, I'll show it to you a little bit. It's easier to see on the painting. And was that your question about the curves? Or do you have a different one?
I was just gonna ask if you pull an image from Google, I think you need to be worried about the quality of the image.
Yes. Yeah. So in my Google search, I changed the size to large. And so when I hover down here, you can see in this tiny corner, it tells me what the pixels, the size of this. So it's 1200 by 850. It's big enough for what I need it for. So I just downloaded this one as opposed to, I don't know, this one, or come on, this weird popcorn image. This is a pretty large image, but this is, oh yeah, I normally don't, this seems a little less believable. But oh yeah, that's the one I used. Yeah, that's pretty good. Otherwise, you can find all sorts of things. Obviously, some of them have like watermarks on them. If I Googled white wall texture, white paint wall texture. So yeah, here we are. This is my finished, believable, mostly believable image right here. And so I promised to kind of explain what that curves panel does. I've actually on the layer that is the painting right now. And so you can see what layers does, or sorry, curves does, is this histogram right now shows me the distribution of values that are incorporated into the layer that I'm currently selecting. So everything over here is dark, everything over here is light. So you can see there's a lot more dark values, there's the mid values, there's another spike where there's kind of a more white in here. That would be these signs over here, which are nice and light. And so I can grab anywhere on this line and move it to then reflect light and dark values here. And I can also grab the edges and move them. So if I take all the white values off of a painting, this turns gray. Or similarly, if I take the dark values and make them light, it kind of turns gray there too. So you can, again, futz with this to do whatever you think the painting does in real life. It is under image up at the top here. So this is my cursor. I'm gonna go to image and adjustments, and it's right here. Also, if you're just starting out, auto tone, auto contrast, auto color are worth exploring. This is just kind of Photoshop's attempt to figure out what the image should maybe possibly look like. You can try them out and see if you like them. If it's wildly inaccurate, you can just not do them. So if I did auto tone, actually, hey, that's not bad. It looks pretty close. Oh, so again, image and just below adjustments, it was right here. So maybe auto color. What does it want to do there? I didn't like that. So I'm gonna Command Z or undo that. I think I didn't like that one. Also, I think the actual image is a little bit more vibrant than what we're currently looking at right now. I'm gonna come to my adjustments and go to vibrant. And I'm just gonna turn that up. I think the saturation is a little bit more than what Photoshop is telling me it is right now. I think that's a little bit more closer to what I think the image is really doing here. And honestly, I think it's a little bit lighter than what I'm doing here. So I am gonna just barely lighten it up. Yes.
Did the lighting reflect like in a like a typical gallery temperature or like outside? You know what I mean? Like with this painting or outside, it was outside.
Does your eye look the same? Does your eyes adjust?
It would look cooler, or like the you know daylight is like cooler lighting than
Yeah. So what we're discussing here is the general coldness or blueness to lighting versus on the other end of that spectrum, a yellowness or warmness. Every gallery, every scenario is going to end up somewhere on that spectrum. And then theoretically, somewhere perfectly in the middle of that spectrum is true, perfect, uncolored white light. I like to try to imagine that this exists on that perfect middle of the spectrum of white light, though you could do whatever looks best for your image. If it makes sense for it to be a little bit cooler or a little bit warmer, yeah, use your best judgment. Whatever makes your image look the best and accurate, ideally too. Or somewhere in its perfect scenario. Yeah. So here we are. Here is this pretty accurate faked image of a painting that started out kind of like that. There we are. Do what? Oh, I think I might have deleted it. Let's see, where did I put it? Yeah, I deleted that layer as I did this, but let's see, I think it's in my downloads here. I think this is it. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, that's what we started with. That's where we ended. Yeah, so I Pamela, for you, I literally took that painting off the wall, put it down there, and then took a photo of it with my camera on my phone. Nothing wild or technical happened about it. I have a very old, unimpressive phone, but you can still do pretty well with this. And there we are. And then to come back to our previous discussion about the fact that this image was like 35 megs, which is massive. I'm going to save this. So in File, I am going to come down here to, if I wanted to save the project, I could do that. I could save as a Photoshop object here so that I could further edit this project if I decide that I am unhappy with it later on. But if I want to export this as a new JPEG, that's what I'm kind of mainly focused on here. So I could do export if I wanted to. But there's a few more interesting characteristics in generate that I really like as well. Otherwise, export is good too. So I might export as, and you'll see why here. That's it. Is thinking. They both kind of get you to the same place, but I don't know why it decided that there we are. So this opens up just more tools, this larger interface. I can more specifically change like the image size in pixels or the image format. This is all just a way to save a file. really. I could just do save as and, you know, TIFF or whatever. I could do it. But yeah, actually JPEG isn't even showing up here because it wants, I think Photoshop wants you to do export. So it's not giving the option. So I just save the object, this Photoshop file here. Let's save as we could. Yeah, it doesn't want to give it to me. Interesting. So I guess that's more of a reason to use export.
You lose image, you export, you lose information.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I guess Photoshop is saying, or you just say that.
Yeah. So I always recommend export, and apparently Photoshop does too. So you can see here, there's a lot of options that are all going to be useful. You can see the format. It's giving me PNG, JPEG, and GIF. PNG is an image asset that's used primarily for digital means. So like if you're doing web design, that would be most useful. And also one feature of JPEG that is not one characteristic of PNG, which is not capable in JPEGs, is transparencies. So if I had a piece of clip art and I only wanted the animated little bird that exists in the middle of that clip art and a transparent background that does not have a white, maybe rectangle around it, I would use a PNG. But for photography, it's always going to be JPEG.
So now my Mac HEIC.
Yeah, that's
God knows, but it's so annoying because, like, for example, and Jordan was one of these. Recently happened with JPEGs. And they showed up with the image, but the HEIC is a total flip.
It is, yeah.
It's a new one.
It is.
Because I think the HEIC is press.
The answer is political. It is truly politics. The whole reason why that image format exists, it's because JPEG is traditionally a Windows derived format, and Apple, in their ever long quest to be competitive and annoying, created their own image format to complicate your life so that theoretically maybe one day this image file format becomes the standard and not JPEG, but that world doesn't exist yet, which is also the same reason why your chargers for an iPhone is never going to be the same charger as your Samsung, is because they're competitors and they hate each other.
But and they're not trying to maybe pay extra for different and new chargers.
Oh, no, yeah. 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 It's the same dynamic between if you're using image files, the difference between a .mov file and an MP4 file. It's just MOV is Apple, MP4 is Windows.
But I wondered in the process it's not accepted.
Yep. Yeah.
You have to change how you.
So yes, you would change it here. Photoshop can accept HTMC or whatever it is, but you can always export it as a JPEG.
Exporting it from photos.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've only seen, original format.
Yeah, you want to modify it to a new file type, which is JPEG. Just as we're doing here is, since I actually took this photograph on an iPhone, it would have been that file. But as soon as I dropped it into Photoshop, I can work on it, and now I am exporting it as a JPEG. Yes. Oh.
Yeah.
From photos, probably not, because Photos is a Mac. application, and it probably doesn't want you to change the file type because it wants you to stay in Mac space or Apple space.
How about if you're on, if you're on Photoshop, then can you do it?
Yeah.
You can, because Photoshop is neutral ground. Photoshop is not owned by PC or Apple. Therefore, it is trying to do both because it wants to be useful. Let's go to Anna first and then Sophia.
So I was wondering,
I was just gonna say, on Macs, if you open it in preview, so you can't change it when it's in my Photos app, but if you open it in preview by double clicking it on the desktop, you can export it and change the file. Yeah, it's so if you don't have Photoshop, that might be a good way to do it.
Cool. Yeah.
so, I use Lightroom right now, and you can like copy and paste the settings for a full, like you can do what you just did and then just like repeat it for other.
Yes.
You can do that basically to avoid having to do this from scratch every time.
Correct. Yeah. Lightroom is another Adobe program that, as all Adobe programs function, work together. So Lightroom is another photo editing workspace in Adobe that is different from Photoshop in that it is mostly focused on photography. And oftentimes photographers need to import huge reels of lots and lots and lots of photos, and then often can export them all with the exact same settings to compensate for whatever the light was doing that day. That's something that you can do in Lightroom that you can't do in Photoshop, because Photoshop assumes that you're just working on this one singular image.
But if you wanted to in Photoshop, say you had like a series of 6 of this exact same size,
Mhm.
how would you would have to do?
You'd have to do it again.
You'd have to do it again.
Yeah, so this is really focused on one image at a time. Though if you like, for instance, wanted a version of this exact same image that was like cropped differently or something, I would just be careful with your saves, or just like, yeah, like I could crop this right now to, if I wanted less white space around it for whatever reason, I just wanted a tighter, image. I could do that, export it, and then undo, and come back to here. Yeah, or you could, save save a copy of this and then crop that copy of it, and then you title that as Untitled 1 no white wall, or Untitled 1 detail 1, or something like that. Yeah. So let's actually officially export this. And so I've got JPEG up here, and there's this nice quality slider, which is interesting to change the file size. So as I move this, keep an eye on this over here. So this is the pixels that it takes up, and this is the amount of data that this file is going to be. So right now it's at 0.5 meg right now, at quality level 2. But if I move this all the way up to 7, it's going to think for a second. And now this is 5 megs. So you can more faithfully export your image to whatever best suits your needs at that time, especially if you have an open call that says image must be no larger than 2 megs or must be no larger than 1200 pixels on one side.
Yes.
You can do that. So I just did that, hit enter, and it resized it. And so you can see here that this image is now 1200 by 1600 pixels, and that just happens to be 1.3 megs, which is pretty good. That's a pretty good size. It will look clear on a screen of any kind.
And you didn't change the quality, that's still.
No, because this overrides that quality here. So if I did, knock that back down, you could see it would change a little bit here, but not very dramatically. I want this to be high quality, but also 1200 pixels wide or whatever. Again, I'm in JPEG. This is pretty much.
Sometimes I say that like Michael's large,
Mhm.
Michael's small,
Yeah,
so that I remember which one to switch.
exactly. Yeah, yeah. So you might export several versions of the same photograph for whatever your needs are. Yeah, and there we are. And so this all looks good. I'm just gonna hit export, and then I can save it to my desktop. There we are. That's it. There it is. That was everything I wanted to cover. Oh, thank you.